Hello and welcome everyone. We're going to get started on the webinar today. So welcome to the launch webinar for the public consultation of the Science-Based Targets for Freshwater version 2. I'm Varsha Vijay, Technical Director of the Science-Based Targets Network. And before we get started, I want to thank you all for attending this webinar and go through a couple of housekeeping notes. This webinar is going to run for about 1 hour. You will be muted as an attendee. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. You may do so throughout the presentations, and then following the conclusion of the presentations, we will have some time for live Q&A. We will also be answering some of the questions in writing through that Q&A feature, so feel free to check back on your question. A recording of this webinar will be shared later, so we encourage you to share it with your networks that you think may be interested in this work. Next slide, please. Great. So before we get into the freshwater targets, let me provide you some context on SBTN. Many of you are already familiar with science-based targets for climate, developed by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, which is the global standard for setting science-based targets on climate impacts. The Science-Based Targets Network, or SBTN, builds on that foundation by developing science-based targets for nature, covering freshwater, land, ocean, and biodiversity, acknowledging that solving the nature crisis is essential to solving the climate crisis. And that's why SBTN takes an integrated approach. Our technical hubs focus on key Earth systems, freshwater, land, ocean, and biodiversity, which is integrated therein, to help companies take action that's credible, coordinated, and aligned with ecological thresholds. Companies can now set the first science-based targets for land and freshwater, as well as ocean, focused initially on the seafood sector. Biodiversity is integrated across those targets. And what that means is that it ensures that actions taken to address pressures on land, freshwater, and ocean also support the protection and restoration of biodiversity by addressing the major direct drivers of biodiversity loss. Specifically for freshwater, current and future methods covered here address primary drivers of loss, including water use and pollution, by supporting the maintenance and enhancement of freshwater ecosystems, including the needs of specific species, particularly threatened and endemic species. By aligning actions across these systems, companies can take enough of the right actions in the right places at the right time to do their part to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. To enable companies to set science-based targets for nature, SBTN has designed a 5-step process that builds on existing corporate practices. This process takes companies from assessing their impacts on nature throughout their value chains in step 1 to identifying what parts of their business and which locations they should prioritize in step 2, to setting targets in step 3, to then implementing actions to meet these targets in step 4. That means first avoiding and reducing pressures where possible, but also investing in restoration and regeneration where impacts have already occurred. Later on in this presentation, we'll address some of the key questions regarding upcoming step 4 resources. And finally, to complete this 5-step framework, we take companies through monitoring, reporting, and verifying progress against those targets in what we call step 5. The draft freshwater methods that are out for public consultation are specific to setting targets in step 3. Next, please. So why set science-based targets for nature? We get that question a lot, just given the alphabet soup of corporate sustainability frameworks that is out there right now. And we have to acknowledge that many companies do set environmental goals, but science-based targets are different. They do raise the bar. They strengthen credibility, improve consistency, and drive real impacts. And they do that in a few different ways. First, through they're ambitious and quantifiable. SBTs go beyond vague commitments by defining how much action is needed by companies based on Earth's limits and aligned with global societal goals, like the Global Biodiversity Framework and the UN SDGs. They're also standardized and collaborative. Science-based targets use consistent methods that allow companies to align efforts, measure progress, and then collaborate effectively across shared supply chains and landscapes with other local actors. They're also aligned and interoperable. So science-based targets are designed to work with major disclosure frameworks like TNFD and CSRD. They strengthen reporting, increase efficiency, and prepare companies for future regulatory expectations. They're also rigorous and strategic. Science-based targets give companies clarity on what's enough, avoiding ad hoc or qualitative goals, while offering structured, science-driven process that helps integrate environmental action into core business strategy. And finally, they're credible and independently validated, a key part of our framework, backed by science and civil society, and they're independently validated by the Accountability Accelerator, allowing these targets to stand up to scrutiny from investors, regulators, and customers alike. Next. Water risks are escalating. This is why freshwater targets really matter. Droughts, pollution, aquifer depletion, and competition for scarce resources impact operations and supply chains by threatening operational resilience and continuity for companies and depleting key natural resources and ecosystem services critical for both humans and broader biodiversity. These targets move beyond disclosure, as we just mentioned, so they're measurable, time-bound action that reduce these risks and deliver positive outcomes for ecosystems, communities, and businesses. They build resilience and credibility for companies. They help companies take enough of the right action in the right places to manage their risk, to strengthen business continuity, and demonstrate credible leadership in their space and sector. They also offer opportunities for stakeholder alignment. Ambitious targets can unify internal teams as well as engaging local stakeholders in critical areas of impact and action. They also provide opportunities for alignment and visibility for investors and unlock resources to address water and related biodiversity impacts. And finally, as we've previously said, they prepare companies for regulation. So it positions companies ahead of reporting requirements such as CSRD, and it also complements other stewardship initiatives like AWS. We often get questions from companies, though. How do I do the work necessary to set science-based targets, especially those companies that are early in their nature journey? So to help companies identify pathways to take credible action sooner, we've developed accelerated pathways. These accelerated pathways will be released hopefully later this month, and they offer companies a more focused scope from the outset of our framework, helping companies move faster to target setting and action by starting where they have the most traction and where nature needs it most. So why does this matter? It helps companies get to credible action sooner, beginning with the value chain assessment and narrowing quicker to target setting. It helps companies focus where it counts most. So it helps them align their action to impact while also including where they have the greatest traction, influence, and data availability. And it also proves what's possible and then allows them to scale over time. It demonstrates early results that allow them to build comprehensiveness in their target setting journey and action over time. So just very briefly how it works, it allows companies to complete a high-level materiality screening in the early part of their step one, what we call step 1A, and then to focus rapidly over the next steps, so that what we call step 1B and onward on specific realms, so land or fresh water, for example, specific value chain segments like direct operation and upstream, and distinct business units, perhaps where they have the greatest traction or the greatest traceability. And this modular target setting approach ensures that companies can start where they're ready without compromising credibility. So before I move to hand over to the Freshwater Hub, I want to just encourage everyone attending this webinar and your colleagues to engage in this public consultation. Consultations are a key part of the work that we do to ensure that our methods are rigorous and credible and provide a practical means for companies to take effective action on their freshwater impacts. So please visit the QR code that you see and the resources being posted in the chat to engage with the consultation. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Sarah Walker, co-lead of the SBTN Freshwater Hub, to go deeper on the new version of freshwater targets.
Okay, thanks, Varsha. Hi, everyone. As Varsha said, I'm Sarah Walker. I co-lead the SBTN Freshwater Hub, and I'm the Director of Corporate Water Engagement at the World Resources Institute. And I'll provide a brief overview of the current status of freshwater science-based targets and what you can expect in version 2 of the freshwater guidance. First, I want to introduce SBTN's Freshwater Hub, which is a partnership of NGOs. We're tasked with developing the technical methods for companies to set freshwater science-based targets. As I mentioned, WRI is co-leading the Freshwater Hub along with WWF, and the hub is also comprised of experts from the Nature Conservancy, Pacific Institute, CDP, and Conservation International. We want to give a special thanks to Walton Family Foundation and the Moore Foundation for supporting this work. So I want to just start with a very quick overview of kind of the state of corporate freshwater targets and corporate water stewardship in general. Companies have been setting some kind of freshwater targets for many years, from conformance targets and efficiency targets to more recently targets that are informed by the specific challenges in the local catchments in which companies have activities. And according to CDP, 40% of companies that disclose on water have some kind of water-related target, which marks a 30% increase from the prior year. But it's unclear how many of those targets are sufficient and really aligned with what the science tells us is necessary to solve water challenges. And that's exactly what SBTN's methodology is designed to do. Since the initial release of the Freshwater Science-Based Targets guidance, 3 companies have come out and led in setting, validating, and publicly announcing the first ever freshwater science-based targets. These companies are Wholesome, Caring, and GSK. And in total, 10 companies currently have validated science-based targets for freshwater, and there are more than 150 companies actively working with SBTN to set targets. We expect more public announcements to come soon, particularly on freshwater. These companies recognize the value of setting science-based targets, like Varsha was talking about, having clear prioritization guidance so they can focus on the most significant physical risks and in turn see operational continuity and supply chain resilience. So as we learn from these early actors, we're continuing to enhance the guidance to increase feasibility, help companies address a greater share of their freshwater impacts. And we'll get into some of these enhancements today. So for the next 30 minutes, or so, we'll provide an update on SBTN's freshwater methodology and dive into the main proposed version 2 updates in more detail. So this graphic shows what you can expect in version 2 that's out for public consultation. Version 2 of the freshwater targets guidance complements the current freshwater methods that help companies address surface water use and nutrient pollution by introducing the first corporate guidance based on new science that enables companies to credibly address their impacts related to unsustainable groundwater use and toxic chemical pollution. This marks a really critical first step toward meaningful corporate action on globally significant freshwater pressures that have to date lacked standardized science-based guidance. So by expanding the scope of actionable targets, more companies can begin to set science-based targets for freshwater. These are going to be especially relevant for sectors with significant freshwater impacts across the value chain, like food and beverage, agriculture, fashion and textiles, and chemicals. In addition, we're introducing the Basin Threshold tool, which provides companies with information on local models and thresholds to support companies through the local stakeholder consultation and model selection process. Next slide. So I want to provide some clarity on sort of timeline and version control. So we're anticipating these version 2 updates to officially launch in 2026. However, companies can still be acting now using version 1 of the guidance to set targets for water quantity and for nutrients. And even when version 2 is launched, version 1 will remain available to use for 6 months from the launch date of version 2 to ensure stability. So we'll now dive into more detail on each of the areas of expansion. First, on toxic chemicals, I'll provide an overview of our method expansion for toxic chemicals. Version 2 that's out for public consultation includes both methods for addressing pesticides and chemical discharges from point sources, but the focus of the guidance and today's presentation is on pesticides. So when we initially set out to address toxic chemicals, we quickly realized it was a very broad field, and we homed in on pesticides for several reasons. One, pesticides are directly released into the environment and are intentionally toxic to tackle pests. Two, compared to other types of chemical pollutants, there's relative data availability to enable target setting. Three, pesticides are directly relevant to SBTN's strategic focus on the food and textile sector. And finally, pesticides are explicitly called out in global frameworks like the Global Biodiversity Framework, which calls for reducing overall risk from pesticides by half, and the Global Framework on Chemicals, which calls for phasing out highly hazardous pesticides. The new guidance on pesticides will complement the existing water quality guidance that's focused on nutrient pollution, as nutrient pollution from agriculture and pesticide pollution tend to go hand in hand, allowing for synergies in data collection and response options on the ground. Next slide. I'll provide a quick snapshot of the main tasks involved in setting the pesticide targets. Our methods really aim to support these targets by helping companies understand their impacts from pesticides and then prioritize action accordingly. The methods are relevant for companies producing, trading, directly applying pesticides, as well as companies with agricultural production in their supply chain. In the case of upstream impacts, to ensure that companies understand their influences and which pesticides are relevant to them, primary data from farmers on pesticide type and usage is required if companies want to proceed with setting pesticide targets in their supply chain. However, we are very much seeking your input on ways to leverage other sources of data and frameworks to find a target setting pathway that works for companies with lower value chain traceability. The methods consist of three main tasks. The first task is to identify pesticides used and check them against a list of highly hazardous pesticides. The second task is to collect more detail on that use. We've been working with Peter Fontka at Substitute to develop a tool that helps quantify pesticide-related aquatic ecotoxicological impacts using farm-level pesticide use or emission data and impact characterization factors from UseTox, which is a life cycle assessment model for characterizing ecotoxicological impacts of chemicals. And the image on the right illustrates this process. So with this user-friendly tool that we're developing, companies can understand which pesticides contribute most of the impact and prioritize them accordingly, as not all pesticides have the same potency. And then finally, the third step, we complement the first two steps with consultation of local water authorities, just to check whether the identified pesticides being used have been found to exceed local threshold concentrations. Next slide. After these three tasks, companies will have an understanding of their baseline impact and will be asked to set one or two types of targets. The first target is the highly hazardous pesticide cessation target, which covers pesticides that should be completely phased out and is aimed at companies producing or sourcing agricultural commodities and companies producing or trading pesticides or plant protection products. The second target is the pesticide impact reduction target, which calls for a commitment to a 50% reduction of the pesticide impact on a basin level for pesticides that don't fall under that first target. And companies must also commit to not contributing to local threshold exceedances. As this target requires not only the identification of pesticides, but also the quantification of usage and impact, this target is really most relevant for direct operations where pesticides are used, and for companies that have a direct connection to their suppliers and farmers at sourcing locations. Next slide. So just want to kind of tee up public consultation specific to toxic chemicals before turning it over to Alan. Actually, I think Angela's next, sorry. So as part of the public consultation, we really welcome your input on this new toxic chemical guidance, and we hope to collect insights on a few specific topics, like how to manage potential trade-offs, for example, with respect to food security, whether we should add engagement targets, for example, to urge companies to support suppliers on impact reduction at priority locations, data sets and other resources that would strengthen this approach, and opportunities to increase practicality while, of course, maintaining scientific rigor. And for those who will engage in the public consultation, these questions and others are included in the feedback form. And we're particularly interested in input from companies for whom these targets are relevant, subject matter experts, and of course, local actors who are responsible for managing water quality. So please do review the methods, provide your feedback on the form, and we're really looking forward to receiving your input and helping to continue to enhance this guidance. So now I will turn it over to Alan, who is next. Thanks, all.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned or introduced me, my name is Alan Townsend. I'm a senior program officer with WWF in the US, and we're pleased to share that the Freshwater Hub has been able to extend the SBTN framework to address one of the most overlooked but essential ecosystems, groundwater. Next slide. So we see this as critical for several reasons. Today, more than 2 billion people and nearly half of all freshwater ecosystems depend on groundwater for at least some of their needs, and groundwater also supports food supplies. So it provides nearly 40% of water used to irrigate crops. However, in many places around the world, groundwater extraction is happening much faster than it's being replenished and driving groundwater depletion. This guidance also enhances contributions to freshwater ecological integrity, terrestrial ecosystem change through looking at groundwater-dependent ecosystems, and it expands the alignment with global frameworks and initiatives such as the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Biodiversity Framework, CSRD, Alliance for Water Stewardship, and TNFD. Previously, groundwater was included in the guidance in version 1.1 to a limited extent. And this new version will define the amount of water use a company can have in a basin, while being protective of environmental flows and groundwater levels. And this approach that we propose here largely remains consistent with the SBTN, with the existing framework. Next slide. So the following slides, I'm going to discuss some of the updates to the guidance, and so are the proposed updates, I should say. So in terms of scope, groundwater specific targets are only required for basins experiencing groundwater decline. Basins that aren't experiencing groundwater decline to set targets basins that are already experiencing groundwater decline will set targets based on protections of e-flows using the V1.1 approach. So the underlying reasoning for that is, companies will set targets on groundwater where they're using it, and then use the existing framework for surface water flows. The indicator that will be used, that we propose to use in this is in step 1 of the process, in the prioritization step, or in the assessment step, I should say, is the Global Land and Water Storage Data Set, GLWS 2.0. That can be found in the WWS Water Rest Filter. And this indicator presents the change in groundwater levels from the first 5 years, from 2003 to 2007, and the last 5 years, 2015 and 2019. And it indicates where groundwater levels are decreasing within this time frame. Next slide. So the next aspect are the inputs. So companies are required to compile their water use over the previous 5 years in the current guidance. In version 1.1, this was only total water use, regardless of water source, was considered. So in version 1.1, essentially it was agnostic to where your water came from. In version 2, it requires disaggregation of surface or groundwater. The underlying theory is that, as I mentioned earlier, is that the protection of groundwater levels must be achieved via the reduction in groundwater use. Reduction of surface water withdrawals are assumed not to be as helpful to groundwater levels. And the guidance sorts through how to deal with mixed sources here. Next slide. Next is the model selection process. As in version 1.1, companies can choose whether to use, or must choose, I should say, whether to use a local or global model. Version 2 takes a simpler kind of approach than the current approach that's prescribed in version 1.1 for the model selection. So if in this instance, the selection process looks to determine if a water authority has a groundwater management plan, and if that exists, to use that for setting targets. In the absence of that, then the global approach that's laid out in the methods will be followed if it's deemed appropriate. And this graphic here on the right shows the existing model selection process that I'm referring to. Next slide. Okay, so the next the next part of the process that's being updated is the required reduction. So here what we propose is using the global scale surface water groundwater model, GSGM, to define the % reduction in groundwater pumping to 1, maintain stable future aquifer levels, and 2, maintain aquifer levels within the routing zone for groundwater dependent ecosystems. And the results would be provided in a similar interface as we do now for the surface water, using an online tool that we would develop to present the outputs of the model. And so that would be used to basically give companies the % reduction that's required. So here on the right, if you're familiar, is the online tool through Water Footprint Network and Ricola Bowman team. And so we would have a similar kind of model for groundwater. The GSGM is just briefly is a coupled PCR globe and ModFlow model, and the global the resolution on this is 5 arc minimum resolution. So I'm not going to get into the technical underpinnings of the model today, but I just want to highlight that we would appreciate your feedback on that. And so to help you with that, we have a number of resources on the public consultation page to dig into the more technical aspects of the model. We also have a number of groundwater specific questions similar to pesticides we're seeking feedback on. Next slide. So we have 11 questions. Here are just 2 of those to give you a flavor of the types of feedback that we're seeking. For this first question here, or number 2, I guess technically, is around the models selected, and if there are other models that you believe we should also be considering for application in the guidance. The other question that we have listed here is around thinking about for the targets, how we should consider, if we should consider the system response time. So basically setting a target at levels that attain acceptable conditions within a specific time period. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Angela Bowman, who is going to present on the basin threshold tool. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are in the world today. My name is Angela Bowman. I'm the Director for Freshwater Metrics and U.S. Waterscapes at the World Wildlife Fund. And today I'm going to talk a little bit more about the basin threshold tool and the evolution of the tool for use today. Next slide, please. First, to level set for us today, defining what the basin threshold tool is. At its core, the basin threshold is a database of information. So that includes data, methods, model links, academic and grade reviewed literature, basically supporting documentation that helps to ease the burden of target setting in a local basin for companies as they're setting their freshwater targets. So information ranges from environmental flows information, which is the core component of the tool, and the supporting documentation that's required. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk through a little bit of the version control that we have available today. So the first version that was released at World Water Week last year was called our alpha version. Basically an Excel-based environmental flows database of approximately 1,300 local environmental flows assessments. These really focused on the thresholds for environmental flows for surface water quantity. Version 0.1, which is now available in the public consultation. Please review the public consultation to see all the documentation and information that's available for the basin threshold tool today. Version 0.1 builds on this version alpha, basically creating a database that sets the stage for our future development web-based infrastructure. We tested this version 0.1 in select Mississippi basins in the United States. And this also includes for the U.S. basins, the groundwater and water quality components of the environmental flows thresholds that Alan and Sarah have both been mentioning. This is technically the first public release, and it's all available on the SBTN resources page. This is a compilation of significant effort from a lot of different people around the world, experts in environmental flows and other hydrological components. I welcome you to please review the framework report that's available on the public consultation, as well as all of the supporting documentation. Please provide questions, comments, feedback. As many of you know who have engaged in the SBTN process to date, finding information at local scale is actually pretty challenging. This tool is intended to alleviate that burden. And as we're evolving this and really focused on the priority basins that we're populating the tool, your feedback will continue to be very valuable. As I mentioned, future versions of this, the development of the tool will coincide with the technical methods version 2 timeline. So for complete release of early next year, or summer of next year, excuse me, the intent is to have a fully web-based interface, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a second. Our focus now is on accelerating populating the tool. We have a list of the priority basins that were identified through corporate water stewardship programs and is available in the framework report. In the near future, our continued testing and refining in real-world applications with companies is our primary goal, to make sure that the tool is useful for companies and the information that is provided in it is not only scientifically sound, feasible, and robust for use in setting targets. Next slide, please. One of the primary challenges in terms of developing the tool and understanding supporting documentation, data, and models and methods that go into the tool is really understanding the scale. As many of you probably have recognized in your journey so far, data comes at many different scales. It was really important to us to make sure that we were defining that data at the native scale that it's reported at. And so you'll find that in the framework report today. So looking at the images on the right-hand side, there's data that's available for large macro basins, such as hydrobasin levels globally. And then there's also data, and most of the important data is the data that shows up that's more granular. So decreasing in size or increasing in granularity from hydrobasin 5 to 6 to 7, as you'll see the different colors indicated on the right. We wanted to make sure this data was all reported as is, and so this spatial nesting that we're calling it is really important in the tool to understand. So at the end of the day, the goal is to have, if you are interested in, for instance, data at the Huck 6 level or hydrobasin 6 level, this green on the graphic on the right, all of the information that is available at the different hydrobasin levels will also be available and flagged for your use, depending on the end case. As I mentioned, the framework report really provides more detail on this, and I welcome feedback on this component. Next slide, please. So right now, the framework that we're releasing includes these components of the version 0.1. We wanted to make sure that each of the components that we're releasing is sound and accessible for the information that we're compiling. Currently, each component that's shown here is its own table in an Excel-based database. And so you'll see that as you go through the framework report, that this information is all available in its own individual tabs. And it's very intentional by design to show how this relational database connects to each other within each of the components. As we're building out the wireframe for the web-based interface to make sure that the systematic evolution of the tool is increasingly useful for end users. As I mentioned, everything's available in public consultation. Please reach out with questions or comments, and I look forward to helping this tool evolve into the future. And now I'll pass the next slide, please. I'll go ahead and pass this back to Alan. Thank you very much.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Angela. So next, I'm going to talk about just other updates that we have with this work for looking ahead to version 2 and maybe even some in the more intermediate term. So next slide. Yeah, thank you. So first is, as I alluded to or pointed to, highlighted earlier, we do have a global water quantity model that is prescribed for the global model for currently in version 1.1. We've worked with Rick Hogaboom and the team at Water Footprint Network to update this data set. Next slide. And so two aspects of the updates for this are on blue water availability. So this replaces the prior global data set with the latest data. And this means a gain in almost a decade of time series data. The other aspect of the update is on blue water footprints as an input to that data or into that model. And it replaces the prior data set with state-of-the-art data set to represent recent historical water consumption patterns. And so this update to the model will be available. We're planning to update that or roll that out in late September. And so, and this will be with the updates to SEPs 1 and 2, version 1.2 updates, which I'll discuss a little bit here in a second, and or discuss later. And the idea is once that data set becomes available, there'll be a 6-month period where companies can use the current model. And then after that point, we'll be required to use that global model. And then for companies that already have targets, would be able to keep those targets that are validated, or have the option to update to the results of the new model, or the updated model, if you so choose. So next slide, please. The next resource we would like to highlight is the Nutrient Navigator, which we also work with Rick Hogaboom and the Water Footprint Network team to develop. It's an interactive map that shows nutrient load loss to freshwater across different crop groups and regions. And We see this as a resource for SBTN Step 1 in the pressure assessment, both in terms of supporting, subnational traceability for various crops, but then also in terms of quantifying the nutrient loads to freshwater. And so that resource is actually already available on the SBTN website. Next slide, please. We also receive quite a bit of questions about Step 4 Act, and so SBTN recently, and this is beyond just the freshwater piece, this is for all the realms for SBTN. SBTN has released a FAQ to try and answer some questions about questions that we receive about Step 4. And so the response option database is already available. That's been available since the original release, and that helps companies to have a sense of the types of actions that they can take now to meet their targets. Additional resources will be available later in 2025 on Step 4, and this will include technical content and safeguards. The one thing that the Step 4 we'd like to emphasize in terms of Step 4 is that actions can be taken across the mitigation hierarchy. So, which includes both the avoid and reduce actions, but also restore, regenerate, and transformative actions that can be taken to meet the targets, including replenishment. SBTN is also considering how to clarify linkages with the wider sustainability reporting landscape, and so expect to see more about that as more about Step 4 is released. And then we'll continue to Step 4 will also continue to emphasize collective action and pre-competitive sharing among corporate actors. Lastly, SBTN will provide more more prescriptive technical guidance on Step 4, and the topic of validation is still under consideration for Step 4. Next slide. So looking ahead for the Freshwater Hub, version 2, in addition to Steps 1 and 2, and for freshwater or for land Step 3, we're looking to release that in 2026. Step 4, additional guidance on that, including freshwater response options and continuing to evolve the response option that we've already shared. Looking to pilot test Step 4 in the response options with companies and ensure that the clarity and practicality of those response options. The next thing is we're planning to produce another communications paper, a crosswalk paper. And a couple of years ago, we had a crosswalk looking at how the freshwater targets align and interoperate with a number of leading freshwater initiatives and platforms, and we'll look to build on that here in the next year. And then lastly, just continuing to lower barriers to uptake. And so we're now reviewing feedback and results that we have received from the pilot, or the initial target validation group, but also just feedback that we're receiving as companies work through the process and the validation process, and then continuing to identify additional barriers. Next slide. Terrific. So with that, open it up to audience Q&A. We've seen a great number of questions, which is exciting to see, and appreciate all our colleagues for already starting to tackle these.
Thanks, Alan.
Okay, yeah, I had
I think
sure.
we can.
Thank you, Marsha.
Yeah. Thanks so much. And we've had just a fantastic set of presentations and a lot of great questions. We won't be able to get to everything in the live Q&A, but just note that we're kind of actively trying to address things in writing here. And what we can't address live in writing, we'll also aim to cover in a response following the webinar. And we did see some clear themes emerging. So I want to start with one question to Sarah regarding the value add for companies to set science-based targets for freshwater. And we did cover this a little bit in the presentations, but if you could go a little bit more into how that value add has changed or grown with the version 2 developments, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So I guess first at a high level, just to reiterate some of the points we made, there's value add for the company itself internally for the bottom line, in thinking about the way that SBTN really helps a company prioritize the most important risks to its not just operations but supply chain as well. And in that way, they can ensure operational continuity, supply chain resilience. And then there are also these external kind of benefits for the company in terms of credibility as they raise the level of ambition. There's value in being seen as more credible by stakeholders. It also provides sort of a common language that helps companies communicate what they're doing with not internally, but also externally with stakeholders and local people in basins where they have activities. And then the specific additions in version 2, for pesticides, for example, like there is no other voluntary corporate guidance to help companies think about what is necessary in terms of their pesticide impact. So that really just raises the bar and provides that standard guidance for companies. Similarly with groundwater and the basin threshold tool, which will really help companies identify local models, also help connect with others in basins where they're working to help ease the collective action process. So hopefully that helps. There's some really valuable feedback in SBTN's pilot report, which summarizes the experiences of the initial companies who targeted version 1. So maybe we can drop that link in the chat. I'd encourage you who are interested in this topic to skim over that. It really highlights what the companies found to be valuable about going through the process.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to move to our next question, and again, one that we started to discuss in the presentations and go deeper into one specific framework. So how do SBTs compare for the Alliance for Water Stewardship framework that's in common use by companies? So if you could highlight, Alan, some of the similarities and some of the differences and how companies can navigate use of both of these key frameworks.
Yeah, thank you for that, Marsha. Yeah, so we've taken some steps to try and highlight that. I think in the comms paper that I mentioned earlier, we can find a link to the chat and highlight that, and in our FAQ. But I think this in general, the science-based targets and the Alliance for Water standard are reinforce each other, and so we've intentionally designed this and work closely, with our friends with AWS to try and align these the standard and the targets and make it more clear of how they interconnect with each other. And so we see it as setting targets enhances the effectiveness of the standard, and while achieving targets also benefits from consistent practices established by standards. And so I think the idea is these two, the targets, the science-based targets and the standard are very much complementary in our eyes.
Thanks, Alan. The next question we have is around how companies navigate target setting for the new version 2 of the method. So will companies still be able to set freshwater or specific freshwater targets as with the current version 1? So can they just set freshwater quantity or quality targets? And I'll hand over to Sarah for that answer.
Yeah, sure. We are planning to continue in the way that it's been working, where if a company wants to set just a water quantity target or just a water quality target, that's okay. And now in this case with version 2, water quantity would encompass needing to focus both on the surface and the groundwater, and water quality would require focusing on both nutrients and pesticides, if both are priorities.
Thanks, Sarah. We'll probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. The next question is about how the freshwater targets are set. So can you confirm if the new freshwater targets are also to be set at the basin level? And do multiple companies sharing a given basin use the same thresholds? And to what extent can they share data to define their target reductions? And so maybe this is a question for kind of everyone. If we could hear from Alan on how this relates to the new groundwater targets, and then Sarah on the toxic chemicals guidance, and then Angela, if you could weave in a little bit of how basin threshold relates to that question, basin threshold tool relates to that question, that'd be great. Oops, you're on mute, Alan.
Sorry, Marcia. I was trying to respond to a question. What was the next question? I'm sorry, if you don't mind repeating. Apologies.
No problem. The question is around how the new targets are set and whether they're still set basin by basin, and whether companies who are operating in the same basin can anticipate the same reduction targets.
Yes. So yeah, that very much remains consistent with groundwater and these updates. These targets are at the groundwater basin or aquifer a level, and so the idea would be they will be individual targets per basin, and yeah.
Can I weigh in on this, Marcia?
Of course. Thanks, Dave.
And
Can you
I
introduce
answered this in
yourself,
chat,
please?
so consistent with what Alan said, the thresholds and percent reductions will be common for companies within a given basin. Those are the same. But the question also mentioned pressures. Note that pressures are company specific. How much water you're using will be specific to a company. So the threshold and the percent reduction is common across the basin. The allowable target is going to vary by company.
Thanks, Dave, for that clarification. That's really helpful.
Yeah, and I can come in on the toxic chemicals guidance, where generally we are aiming to do that at a basin scale, but with the cessation target, for example, that's just a clear, cease using the pesticides on the highly hazardous list, regardless of basin. And Angela, do you want to talk a bit about the basin threshold tool and how this might be able to help companies align on models?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah. So with the basin threshold tool, the way it's being developed is oftentimes within a particular subbasin, there'll be many different environmental flows thresholds for given reaches. And so while a company may source from the basin, there may be some different environmental flows depending on where they're located. But the idea is that the information that's available in the tool will be consistent for all companies across the basin to use as their supporting documentation and setting their target. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we're at the end of the live questions. I'll pause here to see if any of my other SBTN colleagues want to pop off mute and ask another question they're seeing. But if not, I think we will conclude the Q&A and wrap up. Oh, Alan, I see you coming off mute.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here. Hopefully this addresses some of the questions. So we welcome feedback, ideas, data sets, tools, resources that you all think we should be considering. This is a iterative process, and so we've proposed, based on our obviously research and talking to experts on this, just ideas about how to lay this out. But we certainly want and really ask for your input and your perspective on this. So just want to highlight that. Hopefully it addresses some of the more specific questions that we've been receiving. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you to everyone for attending this webinar. We've received a number of great questions, and I know we could continue to address those, but as you'll see on the screen, there is an opportunity to continue offering your insights and feedback through the public consultation, which runs until October 9th. So I encourage everyone who's online and who's sharing with colleagues to please contribute to the public consultation, and look forward to next time we see you. So thank you so much. Bye.